Hi, everyone. Welcome to our week 7 of conflict resolution and labor negotiations. We're almost to the end. We're making that last turn into the home stretch, and we're almost done with the course. I hope you've enjoyed the course so far and found some of these concepts useful and applicable in your personal and as well as your professional lives. So this week we are talking about dispute systems design, and for this week the readings are from the Black Book, and it's chapters 8 and 9. So those are your readings for this week, and we're going to be discussing dispute systems design and what they are, and also discussing the importance of training and education in helping us to resolve disputes and conflict. So let's get started. So what is dispute systems design? Dispute systems design is an institutional attempt to create these processes, these collaborative processes inside of an organization that allow those individuals in the organization to address complaints and to resolve conflict. Okay, and recalling Uri, if you recall Uri, who we have been referring to and reading about, dispute systems design, DSDs, should perform 6 functions. So when we think about these DSDs, they should essentially heal wounds, right? That should be the main purpose. The main reason for them should be to heal wounds. Speaking in terms of organization in a corporate setting or in a governmental setting, but it's healing wounds, right? And then reconciling interests. When you have individuals with differing interests, with competing interests, it's hard to find common ground. And so these DSDs help you reconcile these interests that may seem irreconcilable. Then there's the importance of establishing property rights, or establishing rights in general. And I do emphasize property rights here because while we in organizations we tend to think only about rights, but with conflicts and disputes that happen between organizations or between people or between parties, you're often talking about property or property rights. Like, for example, a spouse and another spouse trying to resolve a marriage dispute, or who owns this piece of land, or how many shares do I own versus you, so property rights become very much a central issue when we're talking about DSDs, and property rights have to be clearly established and defined for you to be able to have dispute systems design work correctly. The DSDs also put power to the test. That's one thing that they do, and they essentially create an opportunity where you can test or measure how much power you have relative to the other party, right? So that's kind of a purpose. They're also there to prevent violence or to prevent future disputes. Okay, so they are there to do that. The last thing that we want from any kind of a conflict, whether it's personal or professional, is violence, right? And we've seen it. Unfortunately, too many times play out recently over the last few years in the United States and worldwide. How these conflicts lead to terrible violent ends, right? So we always seek to avoid that. So essentially, if you look at DSDs, this is from the book, by the way. It's a very simple illustration, very simple image, but it is very important and very powerful. This is the goal, and if you remember anything about this chapter, is that the goal for systems design is to prevent, resolve, and manage or contain. So prevent, resolve, manage. And think about it this way. You have a conflict, right? So you manage the conflict, all right? Or better yet, you try to resolve it. If you can't find a resolution to it, you contain it or you manage it to avoid it to avoid it causing harm. And if you are able to resolve it in today, say for example, you're able to resolve it now, what do you do to prevent from it happening again? Well, that's the point, right? You seek to manage it to prevent it from happening again. You try to contain it if it does happen, and of course you try to resolve it. That's the mechanism that you're essentially going after. You're trying to resolve the conflict today to contain it and to prevent it from happening in the future. So it's a pretty intuitive image, I think, for this this chapter. Okay, now how to intervene through dispute design. Okay, how do we intervene? How does this happen? How does this become real in organizations? And if you look at from what we've talked about in previous chapters to what we're talking about here, you intervene through various different ways. There's different ways, and we've talked about these in the last few weeks. You have informal discussion, so it could just be two people talking to each other. It could be both parties just sitting at a table and talking. You can negotiate between parties, so negotiation is desirable, right? Facilitating discussion. Maybe you bring in somebody that maybe knows both parties or is there to try and facilitate the discussion or the arguments, what have you. Somebody that acts like a mediator, right, to mediate between the parties. And then, of course, if none of this works, then you begin to seek more formal mechanisms like arbitration, right, or like bringing in an advisory arbiter or review committee. And then if that doesn't work, then you seek formal arbitration, right, where you have actually, say, a judge, for example, who is going to serve as the arbiter. And then lastly, if nothing works, then you end up with having to go to court, right? Judicial procedures that might be the last resort. So if you look at this chain of alternatives, you go from very informal to very formal. So you start informally and then you go down to very formal. And in most cases, what you seek is to keep it as informal as possible, because the more formal it becomes, the less flexible it becomes. And so keep that in mind. All right, so what do firms do then to try and do this, or what are some of the ways that firms have resolved conflict or try to manage conflict or try to prevent or mitigate future conflict from happening? And one of the ways that not only firms, I shouldn't just say firms, I should say organizations in general. Organizations in general, more and more now have what you call an ombudsperson. Okay, it used to be ombudsman, of course, back a few years ago, but now in our different world, more politically correct, rightly so, I should add, it's the ombudsperson. And the ombudsperson, the concept comes from Scandinavia. It's a Scandinavian practice, and now it's used more and more in the United States. It's, as I said, it's used in corporations. You'll find it in corporate America. You'll find it in government agencies, and you'll find it in universities. Universities, for example, the ombudsperson is that office or that person who will handle, say, for example, student complaints, or who will handle conflicts between one faculty and another. Okay, so the ombudsperson becomes a very important person and role in an organization. one of the things that makes the ombudsperson a valuable and an effective conflict resolution mechanism is that perceived neutrality that it possesses. Both parties or potential parties that go to the ombudsperson do so because they perceive the ombudsperson to be acting in a fair and neutral manner. So the ombudsperson will not, or should not at least, go and defend one party's position over the other. That perceived neutrality is what gives that ombudsperson legitimacy, and that's what makes that position effective as a conflict resolution mechanism. Some of the roles that the ombudsperson plays, and this we go back to Roe, and that is among these are as a counselor, right? So they might act as a counselor. So think about you having some issues with a faculty who you didn't agree with the grade, and so you sought the advice of an ombudsperson in the university. Well, they might address your concern and serve as a counselor, right? Counsel you, give you advice as to what would be the best avenue for you to take. Then there might be the role of the go-to person, where you know that any conflict, that's the person to go to. Ombudsperson also serves as facilitator of information, of guidelines or processes or protocol. So that's another role. And of course, mediates, right, as a mediator between, say, upper management and faculty, or student and faculty, right, or even among students, right? Could be a conflict among students. Ombudspersons also can be a fact finder. We've talked about fact finding in this class already, and how important a role that can become. And so they can serve as fact finders, where they do the due diligence to try and find as much information about a situation to have the amount of information available for them to make the best possible decision about a situation. They also serve as a liaison, so an upward feedback mechanism. So if you have a concern, you express it to the ombudsperson. The ombudsperson has a link. They have a direct line, so to speak, with upper management and leadership, and they can serve as that link for you to give your feedback to them, right? They also serve as consultants for the organization or the institution in trying to help the institution best mitigate and manage problems. And in this role, they prevent problems. They're problem preventers, right? You have a conflict, you have a dispute, and in and of itself, it's already a problem, but you don't want it to become a more serious problem that can cause tremendous harm to the organization, whether it be financial harm or image harm or legal harm, right? And they also serve as change agents, right? Within the organization, the ombudsperson drives change because they are perhaps better in tune, or more in tune with the internal problems, the internal conflicts that exist in the organization, so they can in fact shape policy. So it's an important role to play as an ombudsperson. And of course, as we said, right, the idea here is to avoid conflict, to avoid future conflict, to avoid making the situation more harmful than it needs to be, and it could be harmful in many, many different ways. And so there are these costs associated with conflict that you always want to avoid, okay? And anytime we look at organizations, we think about organizations from three different levels, and how it affects the individual, how it affects the department or the group, and how it affects the organization as a whole, okay? I added a fourth tier here, and that's the institutional level. So let's look at how costs affect an organization, or the costs that are associated with conflict. Well, at the individual level, think about a problem. Well, it affects the individual's performance, right? You have a problem with your boss, you have a problem with your coworker, it's going to affect your performance. It may affect your motivation, and it may affect your commitment to the organization. At the departmental level, it certainly could affect the group or the team cohesion, right? You want to see cohesion from in a team, and so when you have conflict, it's likely to create a tense environment, and that is going to lead, or at least might lead, to lack of efficiency and maybe even inability to attain your goal at the department level. At the organizational level, if this continues and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, what you end up with is a toxic culture, right? And that's the last thing you want at an organizational level. And then finally, and certainly not least, right, is at the institutional level, the potential threats to legitimization and the long-term survival of the organization or the institution are certainly concerns that you should have in when you're thinking about trying to avoid conflict. So we want to avoid conflict. We know that it's costly for the organization, for the institution, for the individual, okay? And as much as we seek to avoid it, right? Most people don't like conflict. Most people want to avoid it. Most people are good-hearted individuals that want to do things right and want to be fair, want to promote justice, etc. But it's not always perfect, right? And there's going to be problems, and a lot of the time, and especially now in today's workplace, okay? Today's workplace is perhaps the most complex and complicated workplace in perhaps history, or at least in recent history. I mean, just think about, just for a second, if you think about that in today's workplace, think about how many generations are working together in today's workplace. You have folks that are 17 working with folks that are 80, right? Or folks that are at 77. So you have essentially 60 years in between these individuals that might be working together. And of course you have the millennials and the Xers and the baby boomers and all the others, right? And so you have all of these different types of individuals, these different generations, and of course on top of that you increase all of the layers, the cultural layers, the religious layers, the political layers, right, the partisan layers, and you end up with a really complicated workplace. And so more now than ever, training and education become tantamount, extremely important to helping us manage conflict. Because, going back to Ramsey, for example, the common causes of workplace disputes are what? Misunderstandings, right? Misunderstandings that come from what? Probably misconceptions, stereotypes, prejudices, right? Lack of knowledge or cultural knowledge about somebody. Okay? So misunderstandings, disagreement, right? You disagree with someone in the workplace, and that can lead to an antagonistic attitude towards that person, and then you never resolve it, and it grows into a situation where now you become enemies. There could be also fear and anxiety, right? And especially in today's complicated world, right? We have so much going on around us, so many things that generate anxiety for us, and fear, right? Fear because of the uncertain times we are living in, right? And so all of this raises the potential for conflict to happen, because when people are anxious and when people are afraid, they tend to act and react differently to others. Then there's also rumors, and of course this has been around since the beginning of time. Rumors, right? Rumors can spread. Rumors can destroy people's reputation, and so rumors can be a very, very important source of conflict in organizations. Of course, sexual harassment, right? Sexual harassment, and this doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be even physical assault. It could be verbal. It could be just somebody that acts or says, jokes that are in poor taste, comments that are insinuating comments. That can constitute sexual harassment, and that can lead to conflict, because you are likely going to have somebody respond especially if, say, for example, it's a female responding to a male's comments. You're going to have something happen there, right? There will be some comment, there will be some action from one of the parties, and that's going to lead to some conflict. And then last but not least, blame, right? You blame somebody for doing something. Well, you can say it was their fault. He did it. He's the one that didn't do the job correctly. I was telling him to do it this way, and he insisted on doing that way. Or she's the one that made the call. You have all of that going on, right? And so it can lead to conflict. So whatever the reason may be, whatever the source of the conflict may be, when the rubber, or where the rubber hits the road, is that we as professional managers, and especially if we're talking about say MPAs, for example, where you're going to be working in government or the nonprofit sector, or right, you're going to need to have a certain skill set to help you manage these conflicts. So it's not just sufficient to be a good person or a good Christian. That's necessary, yes, but it's not sufficient, because we need training. We need to know how to solve conflict, right? And when I say we, I mean those who are in the position to resolve the conflict. So in this sense, the importance of education and training, right? The importance of education and training. So, but what is education and training in this context? And what's the difference between these two? Well, training is the process through which skills are developed. This, according to Davis, right? And what this statement addresses is the how question. Okay, the how question. How do we address it? Right? The training that we receive to address it. So here we look at things like competence, right? Communication, negotiation, and mediation. These are the mechanisms that we're going to be using to address the conflict, right? We're going to teach ourselves, or teach those who are going to be helping us address that. So we teach people in the organization how to talk to others, how to communicate, what kind of language to avoid. We teach those that are going to be in positions to negotiate, how to do so, what are win-win negotiation tactics, how do you add value to a negotiation process, etc. Right? And of course, mediation, right? So these are the how questions. And that's training. But education, on the other hand, is addressing the why question. This is the process of raising awareness, making you aware, increasing the awareness of the conflict itself. Meaning, why did the conflict resolve? Why did the conflict happen in the first place? Why do these types of conflict happen? Okay? The responses to it. Why do people react in that way? And then the choices for how to manage the conflict. Okay? Going back to Constantino and Merchant, again, it's the why question, okay, yes, I guess it would be the why question, but it's really about understanding the source of the conflict, okay, understanding the source of the conflict, and how do we respond, or why is it that we respond in that certain way, and what kind of choices we have to address the conflict or the type of conflict. Okay? Now, in this sense, okay, all right, so we know that we need training and we know that we need education. So what should a training program for conflict resolution contain, right? Well, it should identify the purpose of the training program, okay? What's the purpose of it? What are we trying to get at here? What's the goal, right? Then you should take care of the logistics, right? Meaning that you should know where it's going to happen, the audio visuals, what kind of setting it's going to have, who's going to attend, etc. Right? So the logistics of the program should be taken care of and should be smooth and efficient. Of course, you need to make it interactive, relevant, and even fun. Okay, remember that people, and we're students, right? You are students, and I'm a professor, but I was a student myself, and you tend to remember more those things that were fun. You tend to remember those classes, those professors that were that were interesting, that perhaps a joke or made a subject really fun or interesting to learn, right? If something is just drab and boring, you tend to forget it very easily. So you need to make it interactive, where people are interacting with each other, right? This is active learning, of course. Make it relevant to them and to their problems and to their precise environment. So, for example, you wouldn't go and do a training program in, say, Los Angeles and not consider the Mexican Americans or Hispanic Americans and these particular conflicts that are relevant to that community, right? Or if you went and did, if you were working in a predominantly African American community, you would have to make it relevant to consider some of the concerns that particular community might have. Right, and of course you can do all sorts of different types of scenarios that could arise. But the idea is to make it relevant to those folks that are attending this, because they want to know how to solve the problems. They don't just want to listen to people telling them about the problems. They want to know how they are going to be able to address and solve these problems. Okay. Be prepared for the troublemaker. And by the troublemaker, I mean not necessarily bad people, but there are those individuals who will show up to these training programs and really don't want to be there. They don't want to be there. They don't think that they should be there because they think themselves as not being part of the problem, or maybe they feel that they are above this training program, right? And so they will try and kind of sabotage the program, or maybe even try and outdo you, right? They think that they know more about conflict management than you do, and so prepare for those, and so that you are able to address those types of individuals. And my recommendation for those would be to address whatever concern they have separately at some other point. And then you can also use strategies like, for example, the prisoner's dilemma. And for those that maybe haven't studied economics or at least game theory, the prisoner's dilemma is this tool, and it's used to show where in conflict sometimes what two people want is unattainable or unachievable, because in the end the desired or the best case solution for both, given the information at hand, is the second best alternative. It's not the best alternative for both, because you can't reach the best alternative for both, right? So I want the room painted in blue, you want the room painted in green. We can't have half of the room in blue and half of the room in green. So the second best alternative for both would be, okay, well, white is the second best. So if we paint it in white, then we are not going to be super happy, but we're going to be relatively happy. We're going to be okay with it. So that's kind of the idea. Right? And of course, as I said just a few minutes ago, adjust to the cultural setting and adjust your cultural lens. So if you were doing training in another country, right, with a different culture, a different religion, right, you would have to kind of make certain adjustments, right, so that the conflict management program actually does add value and doesn't become even a problem in and of itself, right? So it's very important, especially nowadays in our very multicultural environment, a global environment, and in the U.S. as well, that we adjust our cultural lens so that it does address everybody's cultural needs and cultural expectations and perspectives, right? Because people see problems differently based on where they're from, right? They address problems and they seek resolutions differently depending on where they're from. And so as a trainer, as somebody who is leading a training program, if you are not familiar with a particular culture's desired resolution mechanism, then you're really not doing much for yourself in that role. So it's important that you are well versed in that respect. All right, so what is on deck for this week? All right, so let's talk about the 2 assignments that you have for this week. You have, the first one is a discussion board, and this is a 6 to 7 minute narrated presentation. You are to locate a minimum of 4 resources on conflict management, dispute resolution, design, and or training for the workplace. So 4 resources minimum. Please have the 4, because if you don't have the 4, I'm going to have to take off points. So please make sure that you have at least 4. All right. And then you must locate a minimum of 1 journal article and 1 video. Right. In that presentation, you are to identify each resource, then give a brief summary of the information in each resource, identify a possible conflict that could occur in a government department, right? So make sure that you're talking about a government department. What type of dispute resolution design would you recommend? What type of training would you recommend? And then lastly, identify topics and maybe even some teaching techniques that you might think are appropriate. So that's the first one. And then the second assignment is the draft outline, okay? And so the draft outline is simple. It's you develop an outline for the critical assignment. Just use Roman numerals, letters and numbers to indicate the sections. So, Roman numeral 1 and then letter A and then number 2, for example, right? Be sure to include an APA title page, all right? And always remember that, of course, the reference page, all right? I think you'll do great in both of these, so I'm not concerned about this, all right? Okay, so that's all we have for this week. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation. Again, a quick reminder about the last week, the final week, week 8, and that final assignment. So just reminding you about that. So make sure that you kind of take a little glimpse. This week we have a reminder in week 7 for that final assignment. And I look forward to reading and your assignments for this week. And I wish you a wonderful week. God bless you all, and thank you very much.